Yes, the same kind of story that seems to come down from long ago. Two friends.
We're going to have a special guest in here in just a second, Dr. Scott Jensen. I saw his thread yesterday, his video, and I thought, oh my God, I must interview him. There's a lot to get into here. We'll get to that, but first let me get my guest in here. Is Dr. Scott Jensen. Dr. Jensen is not just a family practitioner, but he's also a state senator in the state of Minnesota. Susan, let's bring him in here. Can we do that? Mm-hmm. Here it comes. There you are, Dr. Jensen. Well, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So tell me, for people that haven't seen your video that I caught yesterday and immediately reached out to you, tell people what the content of that video was and what prompted you to do that.
Well, about 10 days ago, I received a letter from the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice identifying that they were investigating me for public comments regarding COVID-19, and they listed two allegations. The first one was that I was spreading misinformation when I appeared on April 7th on a Fargo Moorhead news program with Chris Berg. And that night, I guess it was perhaps one of the first times that anybody had talked about publicly the appropriate completion of a death certificate. And I made the comment that I felt the Department of Health in Minnesota had conveyed information that was misleading and ambiguous and really counter to what I've spent the last 35 years doing. So in the process of that discussion, someone evidently thought that was spreading misinformation. And the second allegation was very nebulous, and it simply said that I was guilty of providing reckless advice because I compared COVID-19 to influenza outbreaks.
So let's dispense with that first. So I'm guessing you sort of looked at the death rate from COVID-19 in Minnesota, or did you talk about the national death rate?
Well, overall, I think the case fatality rate for many of the epidemics we've suffered, they have some level of comparability. Clearly in 1918, we don't know as much about that one because we don't have as good a data as we'd like, and we didn't have any antibiotics. But certainly there's significant data out there that says 500 million people got the disease, 25 to 50 million died. You could put the CFR, the fatality rate, somewhere between 5%, 2%, 10%, somewhere in there. But I think in 2018, we had in this country, we had 80,000 deaths, and that was a pretty strong year. And typically we see fatality rates around 0.1 in flu. And I think most recent data I saw from CDC regarding COVID-19, it was going to maybe end up being somewhere around 0.3. And then you look at MERS and SARS, and you're looking at, I think 10% for SARS and 30% for MERS. So I think to provide context so people can understand what we're looking at, I think we have to compare it to something. And it doesn't make any sense to compare COVID-19 to something like leprosy or tuberculosis or Ebola or gonorrhea because it has no similarities, but It does have a lot of similarities to influenza.
And so what was your goal? What was your intention? I'm getting an echo here, Susan. What was your intention in making that comparison? What were you hoping to achieve by doing that?
I think I was trying to defuse fear. I was trying to let people know, this is a big deal, a novel virus. But the fact of the matter is, we've been there before. And if you think that we had 80,000 people die in 2018 in this country, and we didn't lock down, we didn't, if you will, give in to the fear.
It went way, 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 way up.
Days like that are what keep Dr. Anthony Fauci up at night.
In 2017-18, we had the worst seasonal flu that we've had in memory, about 80,000 deaths and almost 1 million hospitalizations. You do that every year for 20, 30, 40 years.
That's a huge
toll. At the end of that time, that's a huge toll in illness and in deaths.
Fauci is the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health. He says while many take the so-called seasonal flu for granted, it still kills tens of thousands in the U.S. every year.
So this is the influenza virus. This is the inner core of the influenza virus.
But the seasonal flu isn't really what Fauci loses sleep over. It's the concern that a new flu strain emerges, a virus we've never seen before and have no protections against, like what happened in 1918.
In 1918, we were swimming in the dark, as it were.
That year, a new virus emerged, triggering one of the worst pandemics in human history. Often called the Spanish flu, this virus killed at least 50 million people worldwide and reached almost every nation on Earth.
Minnesota Republicans endorsed Dr. Scott Jensen for governor after a contentious and lengthy process. It all happened at the state convention in Rochester tonight. Caroline Cummings takes us there.
Dr. Scott Jensen secured the GOP endorsement, but it wasn't without controversy, and it came after 9 rounds of voting among the delegates here at the state convention in Rochester. Then began a game of musical chairs to get to 60%, the threshold needed to win the endorsement. No one got there after multiple rounds, and it was very close in several of them, but ultimately it became a showdown between business executive Kendall Qualls and Jensen, who's a family physician and former state senator who's been the top fundraiser among the candidates. He sharply criticized Governor Tim Walz's handling of the pandemic and restrictions he ordered, and Jensen's also expressed skepticism about the COVID-19 vaccine.
In a statement on Truth Social overnight, former President Trump endorsed Dr. Scott Jensen, saying he would be a great governor, adding, "Minnesota will be great again. Dr. Scott Jensen has my complete and total endorsement." In a statement responding to the news, Jensen didn't mention Trump by name, saying in part, "While we have not actively sought the endorsement of political leaders, we are grateful for those who have recognized our ability to lead and heal Minnesota."
I wish you could swim like the dolphins, could swim. Though nothing will keep us together. We can beat them forever.
Hi, this is John Cullen. Welcome to another episode of Hypothetically Speaking. I'm joined again in this episode by Dr. Scott Jensen from Minnesota, and it's a real honor to have you back on the show, Doctor. I'm very grateful for you taking the time to join us and share some of your experiences. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, John. I appreciate being on. I've always enjoyed your relentless analytic scrutiny that you bring to the issues, and particularly during this COVID pandemic. You have been, in many ways, like a pit bull.
Thank you. You're very gracious with your comments. I appreciate that. There's not a lot of physicians that seem to be able to break out of this spiral of silence. And it's a phenomenon that was documented that sort of follows along with the Ash experiments and a number of different things. But you seem to have a self-esteem, a sense of self-esteem where you refuse to be gaslighted. And you were the first doctor, I believe, to come forward and say, wait a second, I got to throw the red flag on the field. What do you mean I should be coding death certificates without any kind of definitive knowledge that it's this particular pathogen? And what's with the dollar incentives? You, I believe, were the first to come forward to say that they were reimbursing $13,000 per admission, $39,000 per intubated admission. And people were stunned by this finding. That's how you ended up on Laura Ingram's show, etc. Is this synopsis accurate, or do you want to kind of clear that up for the audience a little bit so they understand sort of the backstory here?
I think you're correct, John. I think that in early April of 2020, I did raise my hand and say that the suggestion from the Minnesota Department of Health and the associated link to CDC instructions for physicians completing death certificates Indeed, those two documents from both the Department of Health and the CDC did suggest that things should be done differently. And specifically, it was around the issue of what is a contributing condition? In the world of completing death certificates, the CDC has been very clear for years. Our responsibility as a physician is to identify the initiating event.
Doctor and state senator in Minnesota who is deeply troubled by the CDC's latest guidance for counting COVID deaths. Dr. Scott Jensen joins me now. Doctor, I want to read for our viewers what the CDC says in part about how to count COVID deaths relating to that last issue we just raised. In cases where a definite diagnosis of COVID cannot be made, but is suspected or likely, like the circumstances are compelling with a reasonable degree of certainty, it is acceptable to report COVID-19 on a death certificate as probable or presumed. So, doctor, what's the problem with that?
Well, in short, it's ridiculous. I spent some time earlier today just going through the CDC's manual on how to complete death certificates and the parts that were specifically written for physicians. And in that manual, it talks of precision and specificity, and that's what we were trained with. The determination of the cause of death is a big deal. It has impact on estate planning. It has impact on future generations. And the idea that we're going to allow people to massage and sort of game the numbers is a real issue, because we're going to undermine the trust. And right now, as we see politicians doing things that aren't necessarily motivated on fact and science, the public's their trust in politicians is already wearing thin.
And doctor, in that same CDC guidance sheet on COVID-19, it references the fact that basically this is a judgment call for doctors on how to fit, I read it, what goes on line 1 and then what goes on line 2 and what goes on the final line as far as contributing factors and ultimate cause of death. But they concede that it is a judgment call. Again, why is that not correct?
Well, let's just take influenza. If I have a patient died a month ago, had fever, cough, and died after 3 days, and maybe had been an elderly, fragile individual, and there happened to be an influenza epidemic around our community, I wouldn't put influenza on the death certificate, and I've never been encouraged to do so. I would put probably respiratory arrest would be the top line, and the underlying cause of disease would be pneumonia, and in the contributing factors, I might well put emphysema or congestive heart failure. But I would never put influenza down as the underlying cause of death, and yet that's what we're being asked to do here.
Dr. Fauci was asked about the COVID death count today. Here's what he said in part.
What do you say to those folks who are making the claim without really any evidence that these deaths are being padded, that the number of COVID-19 deaths are being padded?
You will always have conspiracy theories when you have very challenging public health crises. They are nothing but distractions.
Conspiracy theories, doctor? So you're engaging in conspiracy theories. What do you say to Dr. Fauci tonight?
Well, I would remind him that anytime healthcare intersects with dollars, it gets awkward. Right now, Medicare has determined that if you have a COVID-19 admission to the hospital, you'll get paid $13,000. If that COVID-19 patient goes on a ventilator, you get $39,000, 3 times as much. Nobody can tell me after 35 years in the world of medicine that sometimes those kinds of things impact on what we do. Some physicians really have a bent towards public health, and they will put down influenza or whatever because that's their preference. I try to stay very specific, very precise. If I know I've got pneumonia, that's what's going on the death certificate. I'm not going to add stuff just because it's convenient. I think that it's not a conspiracy theory at all.
Yeah. So you reject what he said?
Absolutely.
Well, it's interesting that in Italy, where it's socialized medicine, I guess they don't have an interest in the money, if that's what it is here, and they just went back and they started reclassifying deaths according to their top scientific advisor. So they admitted that they were being liberal or generous in how they coded some of these deaths, and they're just going back and reclassifying them. Does that surprise you?
It really does. I mean, let's just take someone getting hit by a bus and they collapse along and they go into the emergency room and they're there for 15, 20 minutes. Blood work comes back, COVID test comes back positive, and they die 20 minutes later because of their collapsed lung. We're going to put that down as COVID-19? That doesn't make any sense.
Dr. Jensen, really important conversation. We really, really appreciate your data-driven perspective.
So if I have a heart attack and I subsequently develop congestive heart failure and I'm not a transplant candidate, and it's clear that my heart is just used up and the muscle is floppy and I'm dying, I might choose to go on hospice. And instead of having my last few months of life be centered on going to physicians and having tests and tests and tests, it might be more about saying gracefully farewell. It's been a wonderful ride, and saying my goodbyes to my loved ones. But if in that process, in the last week or whatever, I encounter someone who's been exposed to COVID or who had COVID or whatever, I was being told basically that even if you didn't have COVID diagnosed, if the doctor thought that in that given situation, COVID was a contributing condition, go ahead and use it as the cause of death. And that was just absolutely 180 degrees wrong from what I've learned, because it would always be the initiating event was coronary artery disease, and that gave way to congestive heart failure, and that gave way to terminal cardiomyopathy, and I died. Now, in the last days, perhaps COVID did or did not contribute. But if it did, it wouldn't be the underlying cause of death. It would be a contributing condition. And so we were basically being told, we're going to change the rules. And I said, no, doesn't work. I was in the Senate, Minnesota Senate. Right. I didn't get any response from the Department of Health. I just got crickets. And then 2 or 3 months later, my license was being investigated. When I was asked to conjecture as to why would we be doing this, why would doctors go along with this, I made the comment that sometimes you have to follow the money. And that was when I made my famous statement that if you're a Medicare patient, a hospital might get $5,000 to take care of your pneumonia stay. But if it was a COVID pneumonia stay, it bumps to $13,000. And if a ventilator is used during the course of the hospitalization for a period of time, then it bumps to $39,000. I didn't think I was doing anything other than stating facts that I'd done research on. And I was basically responding to the DNA that makes Scott Jensen who he is. I'm a skeptic, John. I was raised in a judge's home. My dad always taught us to be skeptical, ask questions, and that you could gain more wisdom if you asked a question rather than tried to proclaim an answer. I've been stunned by the fact that my profession has seemingly been willing to be cowed into being less than we are, because we are a bunch of questioners. That's what doctors do. We don't gather together and hold hands and sing kumbaya. We gather together and argue. Is your diagnosis correct or not? Is your treatment plan better than mine or not? Is the patient responding the way you thought or not? The scientific model is 3 things: observe, measure, and hypothesize. It's not complicated. But my profession has absolutely gotten hammered through this entire COVID pandemic.
So few physicians were willing to say, stop, whoa, what you're saying here is not consistent with my lifetime of practicing medicine. You were one of the few, but the area that you focused on was somewhat unique. Other physicians came forward potentially with therapeutic treatments that they believed might be effective, but you came forward and said, from a process standpoint, from a policy and procedure standpoint, this is anathema to what we've been doing our entire careers. And you've had a very successful career. Your practice in Minnesota is one of the most respected practices. You've won all kinds of accolades. Why didn't other physicians recognize that something was strange, something was wrong here? Why didn't they come forward? What do you think is this dynamic?
I think part of it, John, is that more than 3 years ago, perhaps 5, 10, and 20 years ago, the training model that we use in medicine has changed. I think there's been more focus on, if you will, having it be more manageable, when I was trained in the late 70s and early 1980s, we were expected to work 80, 90 hours a week, be at the hospital. We didn't get to go home because we hit a certain threshold of hours. The feeling was, if you go home now, you may not see how this most recent cardiac patient admitted turns out. You need to follow this patient for the next 5 hours while they're in this critical time after they had a cardiac arrest. So I think that my background sort of has pushed me towards being skeptical. And I think the other thing is I'm old enough to remember some history that some of my younger colleagues might not. I remember very well and very, very poignantly the 1976 Legionnaires outbreak in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I remember how we struggled in medicine. We treated these people who came down with pneumonia with our best antibiotics, and they kept dying. And we didn't know what to do. There was no playbook. And what we ended up doing was we did what doctors do. We watched, we measured, we hypothesized, and we tried different things. And ultimately, the drug that turned the corner for us with that process, that disease, that Legionnaire's pneumonia, was erythromycin, an old standby.
Right.
But not a real killer. Erythromycin isn't bactericidal, which means it kills bacteria. Erythromycin says, we'll hold ground with you until you peter out. It's called bacteriostatic. Okay. But it was erythromycin that saved the day. I remember that. Gentamicin was a big one. Sulfa drugs, penicillin, but they weren't doing the job. It was erythromycin. It's called a macrolide, and that did the job. And it was about 12 months later that we were actually able to prove that with drug disc sensitivities on a petri dish growing out the bacteria that caused if you will, the Legionnaire's disease. So when we saw COVID hit, we've been here before. If you go back to MERS in 2002, the SARS Corona 1 virus, we saw then that it wasn't responding the way we would have liked it to. So what were some of the drugs being kicked around in 2002? They were drugs like the antivirals, the remdesivir kind of drug was kicked around. Ivermectin was kicked around in 2002 because it was an immune modulator. Maybe this would have some benefit. I believe that ivermectin was even kicked around as a possible therapeutic agent in the early 1980s with HIV. So
interesting. Well, we know that Dr. Fauci did author a paper, I believe in 2005, or his name is on it, so he's got an attribution, about chloroquine use in SARS-1 and the first SARS. So it wasn't hydroxychloroquine, like you were saying. We didn't have augmentin then. We didn't have hydroxychloroquine then. We just had chloroquine. And he's on the paper talking about the effectiveness of chloroquine with SARS-1. But I think it's maybe more sinister than any of us believed. It could be what have you, just based on the data, based on the observations that I've been making. I wanted to share a little bit of that with you, but before we go there, I wanted you to share with the audience a little bit about what it was like to run for governor and to have the support of the Republican Party and have that convention, and you were in like a stadium, and like it was pretty crazy. And at the same time, you've been persecuted and your medical license has been threatened again and again and again. And there's been some recent developments on that front that I wanted you to share with the audience. Not so much to justify why I'm incognito, but I want the audience to understand, this is what happens. These are the ad hominem attacks that occur when you step out, when you speak up. And so would you mind sharing that with the audience a little bit?
My wife and I devoted 2 years of our lives to run for governor. When I was in the Senate, some people thought that I was not likely to be a good governor candidate for the Republican Party because I was perhaps too moderate, perhaps too willing to entertain any question. I think a lot of people would say that I'm not a typical politician. I've been sharply critical of the Republican Party, that we're in need of a makeover. If all people think of when they think of the Republican Party is a group of stodgy people who don't like new ideas, that's a problem.
Jensen hasn't shied from controversial positions. At this weekend's GOP endorsing convention, he pledged to commute former Brooklyn Center police officer Kim Potter's sentence for killing Dante Wright during a 2021 traffic stop.
The governor doesn't have unilateral authority to do that. You have to go to the pardon board. Do you think you can get the Attorney General and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to agree with you on that?
I do.
How?
We'll have a conversation. I think I can be very persuasive. I think having Kim Potter in jail does nothing to increase safety, nor does it, if you will, represent justice. I think we can have Kim Potter working on behalf of minority groups, education groups, whatever. Having her in jail with what happened makes no sense to me at all.
Jensen also said he'd be willing to shut down state government to get a voter ID law.
We need to fix this, and I think there's an easy solution out there. If you don't have a photo ID, government will pay for it, but we have got to get that done, and I'd be willing to shut government down to do this, because this is absolutely undercutting our ability to work and play together as diverse communities.
Yes. Then once I received the endorsement in Rochester in May of 2022, then people said, well, you're too conservative. But be that as it may, it was a tremendous privilege, John. I met thousands and thousands of people across Minnesota, and there are so many good people. It's disappointing that we've moved from a time where we used to be able to disagree and have hard conversations. Today, it seems like we jump immediately from disagreement to holding someone in contempt. And that's disappointing and unfortunate, because we're not getting the answers out there. But when I ran for governor, I don't remember if there's been a previous modern day physician that was the nominee for a major political party running for governor in Minnesota. And so this is uncharted territory, and it meant that I would be speaking to issues on policy and process that wasn't a part of my medical practice taking care of patients. It was part of my responsibility as a senator and then as a candidate for governor. So I needed to speak to issues about what are we doing with the COVID pandemic interventions? What do I think about the lockdowns, the lock-ins, the lockouts? What do I think about the social distancing? What do I think about the governor shutting down pharmacies' ability to dispense the medications that doctors had written for? All of these kinds of things. And I think it's weighed heavily on the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice, because they've become weaponized. You know, I got the first complaint in late June of 2020. And then that was dismissed after I responded. Then I got the second, and that was dismissed after I responded. Then the third I got, and that was dismissed before I even had a chance to respond. Then the fourth, and then the fifth came, and that was 15 months ago. And that time I responded again, but that time it didn't get dismissed. The board asked me for some additional information 2 months after the original complaint was sent to me. I sent that information. And then for 1 full year, there were crickets, nothing. It was literally dormant. The election came and went, didn't go the way we wanted. And 5 days ago, I got home from being out of town, and there was a packet from not just the Board of Medical Practice, but now the Attorney General, and the Attorney General's office was a part of it.
So now this is Ellison?
Yes, Attorney General Keith Ellison's office. And so they appointed a senior, I believe it's a senior regulatory analyst that will guide the process for the Board of Medical Practice. And they gave me basically 19 working days to decide if I wanted legal counsel, acquire legal counsel, and prepare a written response, which, by the way, had to be submitted 10 days or more before the meeting. So I asked for a continuance, and I received that, so I appreciated that. But that sort of brings us up to now. And this last letter identified some new allegations that I hadn't seen. One of them was a complaint that my handwriting isn't as legible as it could be. Another one was that I've been identifying myself as a clinical associate professor at the University of Minnesota Medical School inaccurately. And I don't know where that claim came from, because I've been a member of the faculty at the University of Minnesota Med School for 3 decades or more. And my last title before I retired from that position was that of a clinical associate professor. But it's pretty clear to me, John, that this has turned into, from a complaint, it has become a witch hunt. And the witch hunt is not the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice. It's political activists who don't like my politics. These are people who have never seen me as a doctor. They've never received a healthcare service from me. This is not me being an indecent physician. This is not me reaching into the cookie jar and using narcotics illegally or anything like that. This is politics.
And it's ruthless, and they stop at nothing. And the problem is that you're a principled man, and what they want to do is have your wife say to you, it isn't worth it. It isn't worth this hassle. And that's what happens when the people around you that love you start getting impacted by it, and they say to you, it's not worth it. I don't want you to run again. Well, then these guys win. And that's the problem. And so by affecting your family and your personal life, that's what I mean. There is nothing that they won't do. And, we've seen that over the course of the last couple of years. They showed up at the President of the United States attorney's home at 6 o'clock in the morning. So attorney-client privilege doesn't matter, right? So it seems like no one is safe anymore. And this was why I chose to go incognito. I sort of anticipated these ad hominem attacks. I thought it was going to happen. And it turns out they stop at nothing. It doesn't matter if you're one of the most respected physicians in the country. They don't care. It's just ruthless. And I wanted people to have an opportunity to hear a little bit more about that and what has happened to you, because it's not okay. The first time we met was about 2 years ago, and you were already dealing with, I guess it was number 5 at the time. And I remember it pretty clearly that, you were pretty shaken up by it. But now that they've got the Attorney General involved, again, like you said, this is the weaponization of the government against physicians. This is...
And John, that's why I've made the comment. That's why I've made the comment to so many. If it can happen to me, it can happen to you. Any government agency, whether you're talking about a board of medical practice or whether you're talking about an inspector or a registration agency, talking about a hair salon, whether you're talking about a restaurant or a pub, whether you're talking about a dentist's office, whether you're talking about a nursing facility, anybody that has the long arms of the government touching that business, saying, yes, you can do business for another year. Yes, we check the boxes. It's okay. Anybody in that situation can see that group weaponized against them. And that's what's happening.
It's horrendous. It really is. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the solution is and how we stop it. But I guess Congress is going to have to figure out that it's happening in the first place and acknowledge it before they come up with a solution to it. But this degree of persecution of physicians is wild. The fact California tried to institutionalize it. California tried to put a law in place to say that unless you say, if you're practicing in California, unless you call it the way it's on the card, you could be breaking the law and lose your license, which is, again, it's absurd. As you've said, this is the history of medicine as physicians discuss cases, discuss the progression of cases. Right? I mean, no two people are the same. No two people have the same biome, right? We don't have the same biomes, you and I, right? I got different I got different stuff in me than you've got in you. So I might react differently to a particular infection. I wanted to also share with you some of the observations that I've had, because the first time we talked, you were one of the few doctors to acknowledge, hey, wait a second. We did kind of stop testing for influenza. Well, after we talked, I started to research the PCR technology. And what I discovered was that the most sophisticated PCR tests, the ePlex, the BioFire systems, have 22 respiratory pathogens in them. 5 of them are influenza. But there's a whole lot more influenzas than 5 strains. And at the same time, I'm looking at the World Health Organization, which is claiming that influenza effectively disappeared from Earth in weeks 11 through 14 of 2020, which, again, just seems absurd. It's like, what? How did influenza disappear from 100 countries in a 4-week period? But that's what the WHO's data says. That's what I sent you. You should have like an email or a WeTransfer thing for me. So when you look at their data, it's country after country after country showing no influenza for 2 years. Well, that's kind of odd. We've been trying to solve influenza for years. We have researchers working on it and trying to develop therapeutics and trying to develop vaccines and trying to, come up with universal vaccines and all that. And by accident, as we're trying to provide protection against one virus, we accidentally eradicate another one completely in 4 weeks. Well, in 100 countries? In the same 4 weeks in 100 countries. That just seems too perfect. It's like if that was the case, we all would have put masks on years ago. Stay 6 feet away from me, put on a mask, and we'll wipe out influenza in 4 weeks. Why didn't we do that a long time ago? Because that's not what happened. You can't eradicate influenza in 4 weeks from 100 countries. That's absurd. When you look at Hungary, they were peaking and it just disappears. I'm afraid I stumbled upon an actual conspiracy.
Yes, the same kind of story that seems to come down from long ago. Two friends having coffee together when something flies by their window. It might be out on that lawn, which is wide, at least half of a playing field. Because there's no explaining what your imagination can make you see and feel. Your body needs nothing, you'll be hypnotized. Now it's not a meaningless question to ask if they've been and gone. I remember a talk about North Carolina in a strange, strange poem. You see, the sides were like glass in the thick of a forest without a road. And if any man's hand ever made that land, then I think it would have showed. And that's why it seems like a dream. They got me hypnotized.
And I want you to imagine a scenario where one of the influenza viruses that Dr. Kawaoka or Jeffrey Taubenberger or one of these lunatics does gain a function on, what if one of them got out of a lab? Would we admit it and tell everybody, oops, one of these strains we've been working on got out of the lab in Australia. It's it's actually one of our strains, but the Australians were working on it, and yikes, it looks like it might kill 5 or 10 million people.
The flu crisis has really taken its toll in Queensland, with new figures revealing a startling death toll. Jessica Millwood has this report.
Well, these numbers confirmation as to just how bad the 2019 flu season has been here in Queensland. The death toll of 4 times higher than that in 2018.
Influenza has the potential to be very dangerous, I think, compared to some issues such as Ebola or a new strain of flu such as swine flu. People have become desensitized because it's there every year. But it is certainly a serious infection.
Notifications for influenza have skyrocketed this year, hitting almost 58,000 cases so far. That dwarfs the number of notifications normally received by this time of year. Already, 139 people have died, including a 3-year-old in Victoria and a 15-year-old girl in Adelaide.
It has been a very bad year, although technically we're still not in the flu season.
Or would we blame it on the Chinese and bats and pangolins and CGG and get a sort of a scapegoat virus that presents the same? Because at the end of the day, today, Pakistan doesn't have 30,000 dead. Bangladesh doesn't have 30,000 dead. Minnesota has got more dead than Nigeria. I think you overcounted. If you've got more dead than Nigeria. In fact, I was slamming Waltz through your campaign. I kept posting stuff on Twitter at Waltz, asking him how come he had more dead than China. Because during your campaign, China was only reporting like 5,000 dead. And I kept asking Governor Waltz, how does Minnesota have more people dead than China? And that was the data coming from the WHO at the time. So I found that kind of stunning. So when I look at all this influenza data, I'm saying, wait a second. Is it more likely that it disappeared from Earth in 4 weeks? Or is it more likely we needed to hide a disaster? And we sure didn't want to take responsibility. So we did the old-fashioned American thing. We blamed the Chinese. I'm afraid the PCR test, never going to find anything from Dr. Kawaoka. He practices at University of Wisconsin. He develops Frankenstein versions of H5N1, H1N5, H7N9 that have got furin cleavage sites and GP120s. He's got the whole kitchen sink in there. If he accidentally takes some of that home on his shoe, these guys are working with some deadly stuff. And all of a sudden, influenza disappears from Earth in 100 countries. Well, today, the CDC is telling us, I track the death certificates from the CDC. And one of these weird categories that I know you're not comfortable with, I'm not comfortable with, they came up with years ago after the 2009 outbreak, was something called P&I. They started lumping pneumonia and influenza together and tracking those deaths as if it's a thing, like peanut butter and jelly, right? So P&I, pneumonia and influenza. So I started tracking pneumonia and influenza deaths, and they started to skyrocket right before COVID arrived. January, February, March of 2020, you were neck deep in influenza before COVID.
Couldn't be much more from the heart. Forever trust who we are.
Concerns over the flu. The first day of winter is still a few weeks away, but the start of flu season appears to be here, with between 1.7 and 2.5 million flu-related illnesses already reported. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, forecasts suggest that flu activity will continue to rise. There's a 40% chance it will now peak in December, which the CDC notes would be considered early compared to previous years. We are joined at the table by CBS News medical contributor Dr. David Agus. Doctor, good morning. Do we know why it seems to be hitting early this year and what that means for the rest of flu season?
We don't know why flu season happens when or where, but it's happening early. It's clear. It's happening in the southern United States. New Orleans particularly hit. And, 1.7 and 2.5 million people. That's a big number early.
Is it too late to get the vaccine right now for people that haven't?
That's
like
a
me?
leading question.
I know. Well, I haven't. I
You're
forgot.
getting it today.
Okay, that's what I meant. Really,
no question
genuine.
about it. Yeah,
Okay.
we don't know whether this is going to be an early peak, say it'll peak in December,
Yeah.
or whether this is going to be drawn out like last year. You know, on an average year, 125 to 200 people a day die of the flu. So this is preventable, most of these deaths with the vaccine, even though the vaccine hasn't been great the last couple of years. This year, the early strain that we're seeing is type B, called Victoria. And that classically happens in February, March. This year is happening early. You know, we don't really know any of these trends and predictions, what's going to happen. But what we do know is it's here. What we do know is it's early. And what we do know is we have a preventive shot.
Right. I will get it, I promise.
Yeah, no, and because you have
I happen to have one.
Yes, I was going to say.
If you do,
should give DJ.
We are definitely seeing a higher number of flu cases this year than versus last year.
You were neck deep. December 2019, January 2020, influenza was going crazy. And then COVID arrives. Now imagine that the strain of influenza that's wiping people out isn't in the PCR test. How are you going to know they have it? It's scary stuff. It's definitely conspiracy stuff. But as I'm looking at the deaths right now from P&I versus all deaths with COVID, which is the fourth slide in that deck I sent you, we haven't had more people die of COVID than P&I for a year now, since week 7 of last year, which is February. It's like almost a year. 2 weeks from now will be a year. So we've got more people dying of P&I than COVID right now. This has been going on for a year. Nobody wants to talk about it. And the WHO is showing us that it disappeared from 100 countries in the same 4 weeks. I'm saying, I don't think there's an epidemiologist or a virologist that could defend a PhD. They can't defend a thesis that influenza was accidentally eradicated from Earth in 30 days by accident. There's no way. It can't happen. And so what that means is something else happened here. And that something else is kind of subterfuge. And that's uncomfortable. But I'm telling you how it's done is rather simple. The virus they wanted to hide wasn't in the PCR test. And I'm listening to testimony from physicians early on. I'm not talking about in the last year, but very early on, it seemed that there was like a severe hypoxia. And physicians were describing something that sounded like altitude sickness.
This is Dr. Cameron Kyle Seidel, ER and critical care doctor from New York City. 9 days ago, I opened an intensive care unit to care for the sickest COVID-positive patients in this city. In these 9 days, I have seen things I have never seen before. In treating these patients, I have witnessed medical phenomenon that just don't make sense in the context of treating a disease that is supposed to be a viral pneumonia. 9 days ago, I presumed I was opening an intensive care unit to treat patients with a virus causing a pneumonia that was ravaging lungs across the world, starting out as something mild, a cough, a sore throat, and progressively increasing in severity until ultimately ending in something called acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. This is the paradigm that every hospital in the country is working under. This is the disease, ARDS, that every hospital is preparing to treat. And this is the disease, ARDS, for which in the next 2 to 6 weeks, 100,000 Americans might be put on a ventilator. And yet, everything I've seen in the last 9 days, all the things that just don't make sense, the patients I'm seeing in front of me, the lungs I'm trying to improve, have led me to believe that COVID-19 is not this disease, and that we are operating under a medical paradigm that is untrue. In short, I believe we are treating the wrong disease, and I fear that this misguided treatment will lead to a tremendous amount of harm to a great number of people in a very short time. As New York City appears to be about 10 days ahead of the country, I feel compelled to get this information out. COVID-19 lung disease, as far as I can see, is not a pneumonia and should not be treated as one. Rather, it appears as some kind of viral-induced disease, most resembling high-altitude sickness. It is as if tens of thousands of my fellow New Yorkers are on a plane at 30,000 feet and the cabin pressure is slowly being let out. These patients are slowly being starved of oxygen. I have seen patients dependent on oxygen take off their oxygen and quickly progress through a state of anxiety and emotional distress and eventually get blue in the face. And while they look like patients absolutely on the brink of death, they do not look like patients dying of pneumonia. I have never been a mountain climber, and I do not know the conditions at base camp below the highest peaks in the world. But I suspect that the patients I'm seeing in front of me look most like as if a person was dropped off on the top of Mount Everest without time to acclimate. I don't know the final answer of this disease, but I'm quite sure that a ventilator is not it. That is not to say that we don't need ventilators. We absolutely need them. They are the only way at this time that we're able to give a little more oxygen to patients who need it. But when we treat people with ARDS, we typically use ventilators to treat what's called respiratory failure. That is, we use the ventilator to do the work that the patient's muscles can no longer do because they're too tired to do it. These patients' muscles work fine. I fear that if we are using a false paradigm to treat a new disease, that the method that we program the ventilator, one based on a notion of respiratory failure as opposed to oxygen failure, that this method, and there are a great many number of methods we can use with the ventilator, but this method being widely adopted at this very moment in every hospital in the country, which aims to increase pressure on the lungs in order to open them up, is actually doing more harm than good. And that the pressure we are providing to lungs, we may be providing to lungs that cannot stand it, that cannot take it, and that the ARDS that we are seeing, that the whole world is seeing, may be nothing more than lung injury caused by the ventilator.
I don't know if you saw any patients like this where the lips were turning blue, but it wasn't ARDS. Dr. Kyle Seidel from New York describes this phenomenon. And so does a doctor named Dr. Zach Bush, and talks about people that are suffering from hypoxia but don't have a fever.
Of 2001, 2002 with SARS, and the description of SARS is so incredible in the literature. When you read the initial scientific studies coming out of 2002, 2003 around SARS, it literally says the patients turn blue and then have to wait until their lungs eventually fill with fluid and then they die. The course of events there is very important. They first turn blue before their lungs have fluid in them. And so there's not a respiratory failure that leads this thing. And then eventually with fluid in their lungs, they develop pneumonia and die. This is exactly what's happening with this COVID strain. So another coronavirus presenting with hypoxia, which is a loss of oxygen in tissue. So the patients are presenting blue and with these remarkably low numbers of oxygen in the bloodstream. And yet a lot of them look pretty comfortable. They're not breathing fast. They're not in any distress. And so the doctors are freaking out, trying to figure out, why is this patient sitting here talking to me with an oxygen level this low, blue in the face, and going into multi-organ failure? Liver is the number one thing when they screened. There was a nice article that showed what is the initial laboratories of 5,000 patients presenting with COVID like symptoms in New York. Of those 5,000 patients, the vast majority didn't even have fever. The average temperature was 37 degrees Celsius, which is a normal body temperature. And so they don't have fever, they don't have any signs of respiratory distress, and yet they have bump in liver enzymes. That's the only laboratory finding that seems to be consistent. Their white blood cells aren't elevated as if they have a virus. They don't have shift in triglycerides, suggesting some inflammatory event. And so there's nothing in that article I'm pouring through and like, show me the evidence that this person is having a viral infection. Show me the evidence that there's some signs in the immune system or otherwise that there's a virus at foot. Instead, they're dying of hypoxia. They have loss of oxygen at the tissue level, and their tissue is being starved of oxygen.
So now imagine your blood ox is like 88 or 86, but you don't have a fever. How do you even know you're sick? And they're describing this phenomenon, and I'm saying to myself, my God, that sounds like the Blue Death. That's the description of the 1918 In this episode, I'm going to be reading The Blue Death by Jim Duffy. And this was published in Johns Hopkins Public Health, the magazine of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, in fall of 2004. The Blue Death by Jim Duffy. H1N1, the Spanish flu. They called it the Blue Death. People's lips were turning blue because it looked like altitude sickness. And as I'm listening to these physicians describe hypoxic patients early on and saying that this is not ARDS, they're not responding to pressure on the intubators. This is something else. They're not processing the oxygen. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, these guys are describing 1918 Spanish flu, which we resurrected in 2005. Dr. Fauci did that. Now, I'm not saying it's absolutely that. I'm just saying it sounds like it. Then you got guys like Kawaoka and Ralph Barrick and these guys who've been doing gain-of-function influenza for years. So it could be any strain that behaves in this way that they need to cover up. And COVID hasn't killed 5,000 people in Nigeria, hasn't killed 10,000 in Ethiopia. Pakistan's got fewer dead than Ohio. Bangladesh has got fewer dead than Pennsylvania. We counted differently to cover something up.
So I think in this country, we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. There are other countries that if you had a pre-existing condition, and let's say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem, some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it, and the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
Can you be sure? I mean, you hear from coroners that that's not necessarily the case. Or are you sure? How can you be confident about that? And is there any concern that it skews?
And that's, super uncomfortable for physicians to hear that they were duped. But imagine, what if something did get out of Walter Reed? What do you think we would do? Do you think we'd send, say, we're really sorry about this? 5 to 10 million of you might die. We're so sorry. We'll try not to do this again. That's probably not what we're going to hear on the news. So I believe there was a scapegoat virus. I think SARS-CoV-2 is real. And I think it presents like the virus they're trying to hide. Give me a virus that presents identically, it is in the PCR test, and I'll find it. The virus I don't want you to find this virus. If I did some cockamamie gain-of-function H9N7 thing that's got all those deadly capabilities, and I don't want you to find it ever, I'm just not going to give it to BioFire. It's not going to be in the array. You'll never find it unless you do a viral culture. When was the last time you guys ordered viral cultures? Aren't they expensive? A viral culture costs a fortune, takes a week or 10 days or something, right? Aren't viral cultures really expensive now and kind of rare?
Very much.
Yeah. So nobody's doing viral cultures. You run a PCR test. What if I had tuberculosis? PCR test doesn't have tuberculosis in it. You'd have to run it. You'd have to do a separate TB panel. I think that's the modus operandi for hiding this. And I've been tracking these P&I deaths and saying if I set the COVID deaths aside, we've got 1 million P&I deaths in 3 years. That's historic. We've never had 1 million people die of P&I in a 3-year period. That is absolutely historic. And that's setting the COVID deaths aside. And so I think Dr. Fauci sort of wants everybody talking about Wuhan. I think Wuhan is a distraction. Peter Daszak, all the COVID-related stuff, the CGG, as long as people are talking about that, nobody's talking about 1 million P&I deaths that just got recorded. It's very upsetting. And I think it's one of the biggest cover-ups in history. How does influenza disappear in 4 weeks from 100 countries? By accident. I don't think that's organic. And then you ask yourself, well, who contributes more to the World Health Organization than the United States does? The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's upsetting stuff. But it's their data. This is all from the WHO.
Well, I think the other thing, John, also is that you're not likely to find what you don't look for. And I think that weighed a lot too. I think that if you look at the number of CPT codes submitted in the year 2020 for influenza testing and put that over the denominator of any testing looking for influenza, RSV, COVID, the influenza pursuit was so small compared to what it normally was. The whole thing was test for COVID. So if you don't test for influenza, and you make an interesting point in terms of what was actually a part of the PCR testing, so that when we run the cycles, we're looking, and you made the comment, I think, that there were 22 different respiratory pathogens present. That certainly would be another way to change the outcome of the data. But I do think that as a doctor in the trenches in 2020, we stopped looking for influenza and we look for COVID. And we could actually identify and diagnose COVID without a positive test. There were 3 cardinal symptoms: cough, fever, shortness of breath.
And
2 out of 3.
You were the one who came forward and said, and with that, I can put that on the death certificate, according to the state, without a test. And that's what you brought forward. And then you said, and by the way, the cherry on top of the sundae, just in case we didn't have your attention, is $39,000 per intubated admission.
Yeah.
So you talk about putting blinders on everybody. All of a sudden now everybody's looking for COVID, looking for COVID, looking for COVID. I did an interview with a gentleman whose wife passed away, Tammy Bay, came to the hospital, presented with a blood oxygen of 79% at the ER. No fever. Never tests positive for COVID. Ever. Never tests positive for SARS-CoV-2. 79% blood ox upon arrival and no fever. She ends up passing away at the hospital. They don't let her out for 2 weeks, and she ends up passing away. Never test positive for COVID. How are these people this hypoxic with no fever? Something's out there. Something's up. And that's not the COVID that people are like, well, I got COVID and I took some and I'm okay. That's not what I'm talking about. That's SARS-CoV-2. The people who are getting the COVID and recovering and they're down and out for 2-3 days, that's not this severe hypoxic, get me a ventilator, this person can't breathe. I think we're looking at 2 different viruses here, doctor. And the data, in other words, is it more realistic to think that it disappeared for 2 years, or is it more realistic to think they had something to hide? I don't remember the last time I got the truth out of the FBI or the government or anything about topics like this. When was the last time they said, oops, we had a mistake at Walter Reed. Everybody stay inside for a week. We're so sorry. They don't tell you about their errors. Are they 100%? Man, they never make a mistake. They never make a mistake. I find it odd that influenza disappeared for 2 years and nobody noticed. Pretty weird. All right, we're going to get cut off in just a second. I can't thank you enough for joining us. Your story is remarkable, and you're a hero of mine.
John, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And what you're saying, I got to tell you this. If you were running for governor in Minnesota and you're saying what you're saying, you'd be in as much hot water as I am.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm praying for you, my friend, and we're all supporting you.
Thanks.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
I wish you could swim like the dolphins, could swim. Though nothing will keep us together. We can beat them forever and ever. Oh, we can be heroes just for one day. Oh